Welcome to our channel. No. So this is going to be an introduction to philosophy. So this is going to be philosophy basics. Everything you need to know to start this course. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. It comes from the Greek term philo, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. So that is crucially what this course is about. It's about developing wisdom. What that means is learning how to think. To think for yourself is the important part of that. So there's four main areas in at least academic philosophy. We have epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and logic. Logic is the key to it all, and that's going to be the crux of this topic. So we're going to look at some basics of logic. The first of these is looking at how statements function. So logic is all about how language functions. It's the mechanism of language. It's a little bit like mathematics for language. And the functions in language have something to do with these kinds of terms we use, such as and. So when you have a statement that says so-and-so and so-and-so, the and part in that, we call it a connective, is the logical function of that statement. So what we're going to be looking at is ands, ors, if-thens, and then not. So we've got a conjunctive, disjunctive, a negation, and a conditional. So firstly, conjunctives are and statements. So any statement in logic has a clause, which is what you're actually stating. So it's the proposition. And you have the connective. So it's the clause and the connective makes the statement. So with an and statement or a conjunctive statement, you have two clauses with the connective and. So for the statement, a conjunctive statement to be true, it has to have two clauses that are both true. So both clauses have to be true for the statement to be true. For example, it could be something like, my house is on fire and I have lost all of my possessions. So what this means is that for this statement to be true, both clauses, clause 1 is my house is on fire, and clause 2 is I've lost all my possessions, has to be true for that statement to be true. And this is how we would regiment it in logic. So logic uses sort of like algebra, which is letters to replace the clause itself. That's because logic can work with anything. It takes away the semantics or the meanings of the statements and just works into this kind of mathematical arithmetic. Disjunctives are or statements. For example, my house is on fire or I have lost all of my possessions. For disjunctive statements to be true, only one of the clauses between the connectives A and B has to be true for the statement to be true. So in this case, it would be true, the statement my house is on fire or I've lost all of my possessions, if at least one of those is true, whether it's I've lost all of my possessions or my house is on fire. Only one of them has to be true for the statement to be true. This is all obvious stuff in logic, but it does matter and it can get a little bit more complicated. A negation is basically to say that the clause isn't true. So a negation is just to say it's not the case that, for example, my house is on fire. For the statement, it's not the case that my house is on fire to be true. It just has to be false that my house is on fire. So it's just the opposite of the clause, or to negate the clause. And a conditional is an if-then statement. These are slightly more complicated. With a conditional statement, in essence, what happens with these is wherever we have this first bit of the statement, we call it the antecedent, the part that starts with if, whenever that is true, the second part, which we call the consequence, the bit that comes after then, has to be true. For example, if my house is on fire, then I lose all of my possessions. So for that statement to be true, it has to be the case that where my house is on fire, whenever my house is on fire, that I have to lose all of my possessions. If-then statements we call conditionals, okay? And that's how you regiment it in logic. This comes to what we call the sufficient and necessary conditions. So sufficient and necessary conditions in logic are to do with conditional statements, the if-then statements. So a sufficient condition, which you'll need to know in A-level philosophy, is wherever event A happens, so if event A occurs, that is enough to secure the occurrence of event B, which basically means whenever event A comes up, call it, say, my house being on fire, it necessarily becomes the case, or it is enough alone for the event B to come up, which in our case was losing all our possessions. A necessary condition is to say that event B must occur wherever event A occurs. So it's kind of similar to sufficient conditions, but slightly different. It's got a nuanced difference. And that's just to say that it has to be the case that, say, I lose all my possessions if my house is on fire. So it's slightly different, but that's just talking about the consequent of the conditional statement, the if-then, the second part, whereas the sufficient condition is talking about the antecedent, so the if part of the statement. So types of arguments, which we need to know. We've got three types of arguments: inductive, abductive, and deductive arguments. An inductive argument is where we argue on the inference of probability. So what this means is that the conclusion is only probably true. Okay, so it just gives, so that the premises give us a probability or a probable inference to the conclusion. Here's an example of it. So you could have any number of premises on an inductive argument, and let's say we have a sample of all the swans we've collected. So we've gone out there and collected all the swans we can. And what we find on this sample of swans, all the swans we've connected, is all of them seem to be white. Swan A is white, Swan B is white, Swan C is white, Swan D is white, etc., etc., etc. So then we come to the conclusion, swans are white. We've come to this conclusion because it looks like it's the case, given that we've looked at all these swans and they all share this property of being white. However, because it's an inductive argument, it doesn't have to be true that swans are white. In fact, there is actually black swans out there. They're very rare, of course, but there are black swans. So that would make the conclusion that swans are white false, because there are black swans. So it's only an inference to the conclusion based on probability. An abductive argument is an inference to the best explanation. It's similar to, some people confuse these inductive and abductive arguments. But in essence, an abductive argument is the one that we use the most. So it's where there isn't, say, enough information to come to a strict conclusion that we can be certain of, but at least we're using our best guess here. We're using a best explanation for the conclusion. Here's an example of this. Premise 1, my grass is wet. Premise 2, I didn't water my grass this morning. Conclusion, therefore it must have rained last night. The premises don't necessarily make it true that the conclusion is true, but I've just come to a best guess because any other options seem absurd. It's not going to be as if one of my neighbours came around and watered my grass or something like that happened. It seems like the best explanation here is that it probably rained last night, and that's an abductive argument. A deductive argument are the strongest forms of argument, and these are also known as syllogisms. And a deductive argument is where the premises entail the conclusion. Now what this means is if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. A premise is basically just the point that you're making to support your conclusion. So when you're making an argument in philosophy, all you're doing is trying to prove a thesis or trying to prove a statement that you want to make, i.e. your conclusion. And every point you make ought to try to prove or convince other people of your conclusion. And that's what the premises are. So in this case, there's an example. Premise 1, all men are mortal. That's true. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. He was a man. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So the reason why the conclusion is entailed by the premises is because if the two premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true just by the mechanism of this argument. But there are two kinds of terms we need to be aware of when we're talking about arguments. There is validity and soundness. A valid argument is just one that fits some kind of logic. So it mechanistically works. It logically works. However, it might not be true. A valid argument might not necessarily be true. But if it's not valid, so if it's not at least logically valid, then it's most certainly not true. A sound argument is one that is both logically valid and true. So we've also proven that it's true. So let's say that Socrates was not a man. This still is a valid argument, but it's just not true because Socrates isn't actually a man. So it's still a valid argument. It's still a deductive argument, but it doesn't have to be true. It would only not be true in this case if, say, Socrates wasn't a man, or if it wasn't true that all men are mortal. So some of the key definitions we need to be aware of. These two here are important, a priori and a posteriori. An a priori truth is something that is known via reason alone, where you don't have to look out into the world to find out if it's true. An example of this is like 2 + 2 = 4. So that is just something we can do in our heads. We can just reason in our heads to know that it's true. We don't have to go out and look into the world and get all 2 things and another 2 things and put them together to see if there's 4 things. We don't have to observe the fact there. So it's like, you can think of it like knowing something prior to observation. That might be a good way of thinking about it. A posteriori truths are knowing things via observation. So it's knowing that something's true because you've actually observed it as a matter of fact. So you can think of this like knowing something post-observation. That's how you might be able to remember this term. So it's where it's what we call empirically verifiable. It's a matter of empirical fact. It sort of links to these other 2 terms, necessary truths and contingent truths. A necessary truth is kind of like a priori truths. They're where the statement is always true. No matter what happens in the world, no matter what states of affairs occur in our world, it will always be true. 2 + 2 = 4 is true no matter what happens in this world. We call it true in all possible worlds. It doesn't matter whether the world blows up or whether any sort of event happens in the world, it'll always be true eternally that 2 + 2 = 4. It's a necessary truth. Contingent truths, on the other hand, are only true given some state of affairs in this world, given that there is a matter of fact, given that we've observed that this has happened at one time in the world. It's contingently true on it happening in the world. These are like a posteriori truths. For example, that I am a philosophy teacher. It didn't have to be true. It wasn't necessarily true that I am a philosophy teacher. Things could have happened in some other way in which I didn't become a philosophy teacher. In fact, it nearly did. It's only true in this possible world that I am a philosophy teacher at this point in time. And then lastly, we're looking at these other 2 related definitions as well. Analytic truths and synthetic truths. Analytic truths are truths by definition. So again, a bit like the a priori and necessary truths. All bachelors are unmarried men. That is true just by looking at the meanings of the terms. Bachelors mean unmarried men. We don't have to look out into the world to see if all the bachelors are married. It's simply true by definition. A synthetic truth is where something or a statement is true in virtue of the way of the world as a matter of fact. For example, this swan is white. It's only true because the statement this swan is white corresponds to this one here being white and the matter of fact. And that's, again, kind of like an a posteriori or contingent truth. So the last thing we need to talk about are logical fallacies. These are a few things to be aware of and some things you can go away and have a look at. Logical fallacies are important to know whether you have actually made a good argument. Because if you've made an argument with a logical fallacy, then your argument is potentially not valid and therefore definitely not true. So here are some logical fallacies. Of course, logical fallacies, so one person might argue that you've committed a logical fallacy and you might argue that you haven't, and then there'll be some argument or debate to be had there. But here are a few examples. Masked man fallacy. So this is where you mistake 2 things as being different because of the way they appear. For example, if I saw Batman walking into the room And it's like, great, Batman walks out, and then Bruce Wayne walks in, see Bruce Wayne, and Bruce Wayne walks out. And then I try to state that they're two different people, or two different things, two different entities, because of the fact that they look different. That would be a mass man fallacy, because in fact they are the same people. Just because they appear differently to me doesn't mean that they are different things, different entities. They are in fact one and the same person. Ad hominem attack is basically attacking the person rather than the argument. So it's like saying, your argument's not valid because you're a really horrible person. It's not going to work. It doesn't actually get to the argument. Just because it's the person stating it and you don't like that person or the views that they might have held doesn't mean that their particular argument at that particular time is wrong. Straw man is misrepresenting someone's argument and arguing against something that's not actually anything to do with what they're stating. So it's arguing at the wrong argument, or it's misinterpreting their argument, and therefore what you're saying against them isn't going to be valid because it's not actually what they've said. False dichotomy is presenting two options that exist, and you're saying these are the only two options you've got, when there actually might be lots more options out there that you could consider. And last one is circular reasoning. So you need to be aware of this because there's quite a few arguments in philosophy that you're going to look at that might have circular reasoning in, or it might at least be argued that they're circular arguments. And this is when the person has used the conclusion of an argument as one of the premises, so that you're asked to accept the premises, which is actually the conclusion, and therefore you have this circular or unfair argument. So there's an example of it with Descartes where he says that the existence of God can be proved by clear and distinct ideas being true. But we only know that clear and distinct ideas are true because God exists. So we can see how there is therefore this circular argument whereby accepting one means you have to accept the other. So that's that. So have a look at some of the logical fallacies that you might be interested in or might help you in your arguments on the course. Knowing logical fallacies are a really good tool in being able to argue for something, because logical fallacies can be committed quite a lot by different people, even very clever people, making arguments in philosophy and elsewhere. So it's really good to know them. There's all kinds of different logical fallacies out there, and it'll help you a lot with your arguments in philosophy. So yeah.